Good afternoon, everyone. It's a couple of minutes past 3, so we are going to get started with our webinar. First of all, welcome to this webinar, Making Performance Management Happen. It's a webinar that's hosted by the PerformWell partners. And before we get started, I just want to go through a couple of quick housekeeping items. All attendees on this call are muted, but we do, of course, encourage participation from the audience. And you will be able to ask questions through the chat feature that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat module is in the middle of that panel that you see on the right, and you can use it by typing in a question and then just clicking send. And if at any point you don't see that panel and you're unsure where to find it, all you need to do is look for the chat bubble icon on the minimize toolbar. And when you use the chat, please make sure to select all panelists option when you send so that all of us can see the questions. Generally, we're going to hold the questions until the end, but we may answer some of the questions along the way if that works out. So just feel free to type in your questions at any time. And with that, I'd like to get onto the webinar. As I mentioned, this event is sponsored by the PerformWell Partnership, which consists of research organizations, Urban Institute and Childtrans, and performance management software company Social Solutions. And my name is Ingvild Bjørnvold, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives, Social Solutions. On behalf of all of the partners, I'd like to welcome you to hear today about how we can all make performance management happen. As in many of our previous very, very popular webinars, we have with us today Isaac Castillo, who is a Senior Research Scientist at Childtrans, one of the PerformWell partners. And before Isaac joined Childtrans, he worked at the Latin American Youth Center in Washington, D.C., and contributed to making that organization nationally known for its good performance management. Isaac is an evaluator by training and does a great deal of speaking on the topic of performance management. Today, we have invited also Leah Galvin, who is with the Omni Institute and previously a colleague of Isaac's. At the Omni Institute, Leah works with a number of nonprofits, helping them to effectively use data to improve their services and client outcomes. The Omni Institute is a Colorado-based nonprofit social science agency that has the mission of advancing the public and nonprofit sectors through integrated evaluation research and capacity building and technology solutions. And Leah used to work at the Latin American Youth Center, where she helped oversee evaluation efforts across the organization along with Isaac. Isaac and Leah, welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ingvild. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone hopping onto this webinar. Hopefully, we're going to give you a lot of good content, and we'll have a lot of good questions. As Ingvild said, I do wish and encourage you to utilize the chat feature for questions throughout the webinar. We will try to answer those questions as quickly as we can, and there is half an hour devoted after the webinar to make sure we get through all of the questions, or as many as possible as we can. So if I can get Leah to go ahead and advance us to the next slide, I want to start out the webinar with a really brief review of some of the content that we have covered in the previous webinars. I wanted to start by talking about the webinar we did on August 14th of last year, which was Using What You Measure, an Introduction to Performance Management. And in that webinar, we covered essentially the basics of performance management and provided an introduction to these important concepts. And I'm going to talk about a few of those concepts through this webinar itself. Now, we also did a webinar on September 20th called Taking the Next Step Towards Performance Management, How PerformWell Can Help. And in that webinar, we really focused on how to use the PerformWell website to really improve the performance management capacity of a nonprofit organization. And finally, on October 11th, we did a webinar called Creating a Performance Culture. That webinar focused on how to develop a data-driven culture within a nonprofit organization. So we focused on what it took and what people to get involved to really make sure that you shaped and changed the culture of a nonprofit organization to be more data-driven. Now, all of these webinars and all the materials for the webinars you can find on the PerformWell website. So there's a link on the slide in front of you where you can find it, or if you just go to performwell.org, you'll see a tab on the upper right-hand corner that says Webinars, and you can find all of these recorded webinars and the materials on that link. In addition, once these slides and this recording is ready, you'll be able to find the content for this webinar there as well. Okay. So one of the quick things I wanted to review from the past webinars is really just the definition of performance management. I wanted to really talk about this because I think people have different concepts and different understandings of what the term performance management means. So I wanted to present a couple definitions so we're all operating in the same framework or the same space on what this concept means. So I'll start with a very formal federal level definition of performance management from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. And they define performance management as the systemic process by which an agency involves its employees as individuals and members of a group in the accomplishment of agency mission and goals. Now, there are two words I think I really want to highlight in this definition is the word process and also the word accomplishment. Process because performance management very much is a process. It's a never-ending thing, and we'll focus a lot of today's webinar on that concept. And then you have accomplishment as well, because I think so much of performance management is actually doing something with your data, doing something with your information to actually accomplish something. So now that we've had a more formal definition, I want to kind of look at our definition that we utilize as members of the PerformWell community. We define performance management really in kind of two chunks or in two steps. The first is performance management is a dynamic process that is designed to better understand program operations, monitor outcomes, and ultimately help nonprofits become high-performing organizations which produce positive outcomes. And you can see that there are two words, dynamic and understand, that we wanted to highlight. Secondly, performance management involves regular, ongoing performance measurement, reporting, analysis, and program modification. So you can see with this definition, we really focus on a lot of the things that need to be done to make sure performance management happens, and really focus on some of these other really related concepts to make sure that if performance management happens in an organization, it's going to happen very successfully and effectively. So now that we've talked performance management definition, I also want to review a little bit of a previous webinar that talked about culture and what's needed to actually produce a culture change to make performance management happen in an organization. So when thinking about performance management and the culture change, you really need to be thinking about how you change how the organization operates. Organizations, nonprofit organizations in particular, direct service organizations, often treat data and information reporting as an afterthought or really as a requirement that they have to do to keep the checks coming through the door. And in terms of performance management, you really need to shift that thinking away from those types of concepts, away from that thinking, and really reconceptualize how information can be used and who is going to be used it. So information and data really needs to be seen as a positive thing and not necessarily a negative thing, and information and data should be used to inform programmatic practice and make evolution in the programs. Now, finally, information needs to be conceptualized and seen as a very valuable and useful and necessary resource for every member of the nonprofit organization. You really do need data and information to work to improve participant outcomes, because in the grand scheme of things, it really is about improving outcomes at the end of the day for your participants. And that's why performance management is a critical and important process. And these types of things are what needs to happen to shift the culture to be more friendly towards performance management. So at this point, I actually want to bring Lee in to give her perspective and some of her initial thoughts on what actually needs to be in place within a nonprofit organization to make sure performance management can happen successfully. So Leah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. Thanks, Isaac. So, as you mentioned, organizations that are most successful at implementing and sustaining performance management pay attention to the culture of their organization, and they can do this in three ways. First of all, the organization must have a larger commitment to becoming a learning organization. Now, the key to a learning organization is that it uses data to not only measure programmatic impact, but also to evaluate whether it is in fact learning to get better at its work. So how do organizations do this? Well, they do it by using data to directly connect their own actions to the results they get and honestly face the reality of the situation and what changes might need to be made. Second, organizations are working towards a clear understanding of the larger landscape. And what I mean by landscape is that the organization's overall goals and objectives are aligned with their slate of programming. And this can oftentimes be demonstrated through documents like theories of change, logic models, etc. Finally, there's one more critical need to address, and it's probably one of the most important concepts to take away from this webinar, and that is that the organization must honestly assess its own capacity to build and sustain a new culture at all levels. So hopefully your organization isn't just saying, we're doing performance management, right? Because we all know that just saying something is true, it doesn't mean it is true. If you really want performance management to happen in your agency, you need to ask these questions. Is our organization willing to devote resources to support performance management? Will we allocate time and leadership to learn and embrace new ideas? Will we develop a plan for our own learning and improvement? And is it one that dedicates the resources needed to shift culture and build capacity so that it's sustainable over time? So these are three crucial needs that sort of need to be in place or in progress as you begin to implement performance management. But these are much larger concepts, and we really won't be covering these in any kind of detail in this webinar. However, there are 2 upcoming webinars being held by PerformWell specifically focused on these concepts, and we will be providing more details about this at the end of the presentation. So remember, these 3 needs are critical. If you want to do performance management well, you'll want to keep these ideas in focus. So let's say your foundational pieces are in place, or at least in progress, and you're really ready to get started. When organizations do start thinking about programs and services and goals and outcomes, they often think of them as a linear process. And this is good, right? After all, it's one of those needs we just identified around being able to clearly articulate the link between services and outcomes. Now, performance management as a process is better thought of as a cycle. And within this cycle, there are steps that need to be taken. Finally, and probably most importantly, the performance management cycle is an ongoing process. And so I'm going to let Isaac go ahead and talk a little bit about how we see these steps as being part of a larger ongoing performance management cycle.
Great, thanks, Leah. When Leah and I were working together at the Latin American Youth Center, we really wanted to come up with a way to sort of think about performance management in a non-linear way, because we didn't think that performance management as a process happened in a purely linear manner. So after some discussions and several iterations, we came up with what you see on your screen now, which we've called the performance management cycle. And there are multiple steps within this cycle. So the bulk of the remainder of the webinar today is going to focus on this cycle and each of the individual steps within the cycle. Now, you'll notice that their cycle has 4 different colors on it, and that's on purpose. We're chunking out several of the steps because they're very related, but we're going to talk about each of these steps individually. And you see the first step begins with defining success for program participants. We go to identifying, modifying, developing data collection methods, moving on to training of staff in data collection methods. And those 3 are essentially kind of the first 3 steps that have to happen in the process. Then we kind of transition to beginning the program and beginning your data collection, conducting ongoing quality assurance checks, providing interim reports to staff, completing data collection and data cleaning. And those are really happening while the program is in progress, while the services are being delivered. Then when the services and the programming ends, you have the step of analyzing the data and preparing the reports. And that's really all about getting the information aggregated and analyzed in a way where it can then be utilized. And then we get to the final 2 steps, which are sharing outcomes and reports to staff and using those outcomes and reports to improve and change the program. So this was just a quick overview on the cycle, but now I wanted to actually transition and go through each of these steps in detail and talk about really what makes up each of these steps within the larger concept of the performance management cycle. So Leah, if we can go ahead and start moving on to the first step. The first step when thinking about performance management, you really need to start about how you define success for participants. And this may seem like an easy concept and something that people have thought about in depth already with each of their organizations or each of their programs. But when we talk about defining success, we're talking about a very specific process and being very detailed with what your definitions and what your definitions of success are. So the first point I want to make here is you need to work with program or organizational staff at multiple different levels to really define what success looks like for participants. And I use the term success here very intentionally because I think when you start throwing around words like evaluation or data or sometimes even outcomes, people just have a negative reaction to those terms sometimes, but people like to talk about success, and people like to talk about success with the participants that they are working with. And I think that's really the way you start this conversation with people from all levels within your organization. You really start talking about what success looks like. But it's not enough to just really talk about success in the abstract. You really need to be specific as to what your definition and interpretation of success is. So, the example I give here is people might just say, well, we hope our clients and participants get better, but that's simply not good enough. You need to really articulate what get better really means and encourage your staff and even yourself, you should push yourself to do this, to share examples of what success looks like and to provide as much detail as possible. So one of the most common sort of definitions or responses I get when I ask programs to help define what success is for their participants, they often throw around the term leadership, and they hope that their participants, particularly if they're youth, become greater leaders or exhibit stronger leadership capacity or capabilities. And I always stop them and I ask them, well, what do you mean by leadership? What does leadership look like? Does it mean that the participants communicate better with each other, communicate better with staff? Does it mean that they are successfully managing activities? Does it mean that they can actually supervise others? That's the kind of level of detail you need to get down to really define success. And once you do that, then those more detailed descriptions of what success is start to become the outcomes that you want to achieve for your program. And it's important to remember and keep in mind that you really want to try your limit to yourself while you're first starting this out to 3 or 4 outcomes at a time for your program. You want to fight the urge that everyone has to try to list 10 or 20 or 50 different outcomes or things you hope that your participants will ultimately achieve, when in reality you want to focus on a few things and then really kind of limit it down so that you can do a better job ultimately measuring towards those definitions of success. Now, I think oftentimes there's some questions or some thoughts about this where if there's no defined point of a beginning or an end point for a program, can you still do this process? And absolutely you can. You just need to be able to pick a point where you can set aside some time and say, we're going to take a pause. We can still operate the program, but we're going to take a pause how we think about the program and start really conceptualizing what success means going from this point forward. Okay, so Leah, if you want to advance the slide, that's a good point. So once you've defined success, and once you actually have a detailed description of what success looks like for participants, then it's time to get to the second step in the performance management cycle. And that step is you need to identify your data collection methods, how you're actually going to collect data and information to measure whether or not you're meeting your definition of success. So that's really what this step is really focused on. And in terms of the types of methods that you can utilize, there are literally dozens. I mean, I've listed just 5 here, but I don't want people to be limited to these 5 things. You could use surveys or pre and post tests. You could use focus groups or interviews. You can do case notes or case management types of things. You can have data that's collected from external sources. So for example, you can get report cards or standardized test scores if you're looking at academic outcomes, or you can have assessments of all sorts of varieties from mental health to physical health to academic. All of those things can be really good uses of data and ways that you can collect information to help determine if you're meeting and making progress at the definition of success. So I also want to emphasize here that PerformWell, the website, can actually help you a lot in really determining and identifying the best measures of success and the best ways to actually collect this data and information. So if you have the chance after the webinar, you go into PerformWell, you're going to notice that there are 2 tabs on PerformWell, one that's called Identify Outcomes, which really help you define success for your participants, and there's one called Find Surveys and Assessments, which will then help you to identify surveys or other tools that you can utilize to really be able to measure whether or not you're achieving your interpretations or your refinement of the term success. Now, The other point I want to make with this is it's always important to keep in mind sort of the timing of your measures of success and when you're going to be getting this data and information back. The reason I say that is because a lot of times people will have definitions or interpretation of success that happen in the long term. So a lot of times people, particularly if they're focused on youth or children, they'll use high school graduation as an outcome or as a definition of success. Well, high school graduation can take a long time. It should take a long time. And if you have a program that's working with 8th graders, 9th graders, 10th graders, you won't be able to know if they've graduated from high school for several years. And in most instances, you don't want to or can't wait that long to see if the outcome has taken place. You want to have some sort of measurement and some sort of definition of success in the interim to actually see if people are progressing towards that longer-term outcome along the way. So you need to think about interim measures of success as well as methods to collect data and to measure progress towards those interim measures of success as well. So always be thinking about the timing of these things and when and how quickly you theoretically could get your data and information back. Okay, so we've defined success and we've got our measures in place. We've got our tools. We know how we're going to measure success. It could be one or a combination of methods. Then we get to the step in the performance management cycle where we start thinking about training staff and training others that how to use those data collection methods. And what I mean here is really it's not good enough to simply decide we're going to use this survey and pass it out to staff and have them hand it out to your participants. But there needs to be some training on the actual use, the actual administration of the instrument and the administration of the survey so people are doing it consistently and people are doing it accurately. So with this slide, when I say detailed trainings, it really is detailed instructions to the staff on how they're going to use the data collection methods, you know, how that process is going to work in the real world and how they should deal with or address any challenges or things that happen that are out of the ordinary. So it could be instructions or script that they read out to participants before they hand out the survey, or it could be specified tools or steps that they utilize for what they do once they collect the surveys once they're completed, or how they can double check the answers to make sure there's nothing missing. This is the kind of detail I'm talking about. Now, once that detailed training is provided, there also should be some training and guidance on what is done with the information and the data and the tools themselves. And that's the second point on data entry. So once you got the information, once you have a completed survey, once you have a completed case management note, who enters the data into what system or what type of software, and whose responsibility is that? Do you have all the surveys are collected on paper form and they all get handed to someone and that person does data entry? Is each person responsible for their own data entry? Is there timing or guidance or scheduling or deadlines around the data entry of when it needs to happen? Those are also things where you as an organization or as a program, as an individual, need to think about providing guidance to the staff. Now, in addition to that, you need to do refresher trainings at various points in time. You know, if you have a year-long or an academic year-long program and you provide training on giving a survey at the beginning of the academic year, you might need to provide a refresher training at the end to really kind of refresh people or get people to remember the techniques and the procedures that you want them to utilize at the end of the program, because it might be 6-9 months later and people might not remember what you wanted them to remember. In addition, because we all work at nonprofit organizations and we know that turnover is a problem at nonprofit organizations, you're going to get new staff into your program or your organization, and you need to train the new staff in your culture, in your data collection methods, in your expectations around data so that they are operating at the same level and the same cultural understanding of where you are as staff that have been there for a longer period of time that you've trained previously. So the refresher trainings and trainings for new staff are really, really important things to think about in the process. Then you should also, and I think this is probably the most important part actually on this slide, it's not enough to give training, it's not enough to give guidance, it's not enough to do refresher trainings, but I think throughout this entire process you really need to explain the importance of why you are collecting the data and why it is important. I think if you just tell people we need to collect it because we need to satisfy funders, or we just need you to collect it and that's the way it is and that's the way we operate, without giving an explanation, then people are going to, you know, not take it seriously or not really buy into the process. You really need to inform them that you're collecting this data for the betterment of your program, for the betterment of your services, and for the betterment of the participants that come in your door. So it's critical to get that buy-in from the staff to make sure that the whole process from this point on forward is going to go smoothly and cleanly. So if we can just go back to this next slide, to this performance management cycle, and you're going to see us continually return back to this so people have an understanding of how it operates. I just covered the first 3 steps, the ones in purple beginning at the top of the slide, defining success, to identifying your data collection methods and tools, to training your staff. And ideally, all 3 of these things will happen before the program has started. We'll talk about the reality of situations in a little bit, but ideally those things happen before your program starts. So here's now where I want to turn it over to Leah and have her talk through the next 4 steps, which should be happening once you start delivering services and as you continue to deliver services throughout your programmatic year or your programmatic cohort. So Leah, can you come in and talk about the next few steps?
Definitely. So ideally, the steps that Isaac just talked about has happened before the program, and so now your program has started, and it's time to tackle the steps in this next phase, which are happening during your program. And I'm going to be talking about sort of the steps in green here. So the first sort of piece when you start a program is you want to complete your intake or your entry data collection process. And what I mean by that…
Leah, can you advance the slide real quick?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I forgot I was in charge of that. Okay. Yep, so your first step is going to be to identify the process for collecting the data that you've determined as important. And then, of course, you're going to need to identify the person responsible for managing this process. So this is really important because this is your opportunity to get the most important sort of demographic type of information from the participants that are entering into your program, as well as any other measures you've put in place that you've deemed important as part of the beginning of the program. So for example, a pre-test if you're looking to track change in knowledge over time. And then, like Isaac was saying, you want to make sure that you have a person or you've identified a process so that this can actually happen, and it happens in a fashion that is streamlined so that you're getting the most data. Second is that you really want to use the first few weeks of the program to determine if what you've put together in your measures are in fact capturing what you want. So for example, you might realize that you're missing a field or an answer category that's really important, that the staff maybe have identified, they want to include transgender in addition to male and female. And so first of all, you need to make that change to any documents where you're collecting that information. And then if you're using any sort of software platforms or whatever your data storage system is, you need to make the change there. And then you need to work with staff to gather that missing information from participants that are already active, who have already completed the intake form where the field was initially missing. Finally, this last point is all about quick fixes. And what I'm thinking with this is, are there any kind of quick tweaks that you can make to help the data entry experience easier for the user? So do as much as you can to ease the burden of data entry for your staff, and most likely your data will be more reliable. So Isaac, can you give an example on this one?
Well, I think some of these are when I think of this, or in the organizations I've worked with, I think it's thinking about who and when people are going to actually enter the data and giving them some time and space to do it. So I've seen organizations where it's not enough to just tell their staff, we want you to enter the data, but rather they're going to say, we're going to give you time every Friday at 9 a.m. for an hour to do the data entry, or we expect you to do the data entry at 5 p.m. every day from 5 p.m. to 5:15 right before you leave for the day. So it's helping people think through the reality and kind of the day-to-day of their situation and giving them some solutions to help them really get through this process. Leah, I actually wanted to ask you a question about this, which is, I think you've emphasized these kind of things here at the beginning of the program. Can you talk about why it's important to do this stuff now at the beginning rather than sort of waiting later on when the program's been operating for a while?
Absolutely. So it's important to do it now because the longer you wait, the longer you're increasing your chance to miss data, basically. And it's also part of the management piece, right? Like, we're talking about all of this stuff in the context of management, and so management happens throughout. And if you are identifying processes in the beginning, and then in the middle you're waiting a few weeks, and you can see that you're missing things or things need to be taken away, or that you need to provide staff with more time to do data entry so that you get better data, it's all part of that management piece. And ultimately, the goal is to have the most accurate, clean data possible at the end of the program that's useful in helping you determine whether or not you're meeting your outcomes.
Great, thanks, Leah. Let's talk about the next step, which is quality assurance checks.
Okay, so this is all about making sure you're going to get what you need at the end by checking your progress along the way. It's very similar to the step before, and it's similar to what Isaac was talking about when he's saying making sure that that you have measures in place at the right time. So as we all know, we can't do something well unless we dedicate the time it deserves and we check it along the way. And the third bullet is really about maintaining the culture, right? It's supporting the people who are doing the work. Mistakes happen, we're human. We want to give our staff the room to make mistakes, but mistakes are an opportunity to learn and make our work better. And so if you are implementing ongoing, quality assurance checks, then you are, as a manager or a staff person, going to be better positioned to have better data and ultimately be helping your clients more.
So here's the point where I can see that many people on the webinar right now really aren't focused or being detail-oriented because there's an intentional mistake on this slide and no one seems to have pointed out on the chat. And I did that on purpose. Everyone make mistakes, which is not grammatically correct, to show that you should be looking for mistakes and identifying mistakes on a regular basis throughout everything that you do and then bringing them to people's attention in a non-judgmental way. It's okay. We're all human. We all make mistakes. The key to this process is identifying mistakes and then helping people to overcome or address those mistakes, because ultimately we want to change those mistakes so that we can better serve the clients and participants who come through our doors.
So Isaac touched on this a little bit, but I think this is probably one of the most critical parts of the second phase in the performance management cycle. So take a minute to review the bullet points on this slide. Take about 20 seconds. And what's so critical about this particular component is that it really makes it different from traditional program management, where you start the program, deliver services, and then may or may not collect or review any data before a final report is completed, or you may not even do a final report, or you may not have any sort of evaluation components in your organization or program. And so this step is essentially turning data into information and sharing it with staff throughout the duration of the program. Generating reports gives us the opportunity to review the information collected so far and speculate on the reasons for successes, failures, or if there aren't any changes thus far, which could be fine. Once people agree on what the data mean, you can make necessary changes to the program, whether that's curriculum, staffing, or any other contributing variables at that time. And so this becomes another form of quality control because you can make adjustments mid-program or midway instead of waiting to the very end and you've lost the chance to make adjustments and really help improve your outcomes for your clients.
And Leah, if I can jump in here, again, I think I agree with you that this really is one of these really critical steps that I think gets overlooked by many people. I think people far too often try to wait until the end of the program to kind of figure out if things are working or not. And I think unless you're doing some sort of examination or look at your information or look at your data in the interim while things are running, you lose the chance to be able to make mid-course corrections and potentially address things that are problematic or maybe leading to less than desired outcomes. And you can do those things even by looking at simple things like demographics or attendance. I've seen examples of programs and organizations in the past that they look at their initial program attendance over the first 4 or 5 sessions and can identify trends where one population or one group, let's say, one group people from one school versus another school aren't attending as frequently as they would like, and then they can immediately take steps to address that. They can do increased outreach or get the staff to work with those youth that don't seem to be coming back anymore. So those are the kind of things where it's not just about creating the report itself, but it's about using those reports to make changes so that you can ensure that you're getting the highest quality outcomes even while you're still operating the program.
So finally, you want to complete your data collection at the end of your program. You basically want to have as much information as you can possibly gather, and you want to make sure it's clean and useful. Without enough data, it's hard to really determine what worked and didn't work. The last thing you want to have happen is to draw incorrect conclusions about the program's effectiveness based on incomplete data. That's got to be one of the most frustrating feelings I know for staff that I've worked with, for myself as an evaluator. You've done all this work, and then at the end you sort of realize, man, we really don't have anything that's useful. And so going back to sort of the steps that you can take, you want to complete all data collection for as many participants as possible. So making sure all people are getting post-tests, updating demographics, making sure attendance is updated, making sure that you're doing those final quality assurance checks. So managers are making sure that the staff are getting that data in, making sure that the dates are right for the pre and post test, right? Like I know at LAYC a couple of times our division experienced times when we couldn't determine which assessment was the pre and which assessment was the post because the date was the same or the staff had put it in wrong or whatever, and we essentially had to throw it out because we didn't know which was which. And that's a frustrating feeling on all parties. So you want to make sure you have your data, it's good, it's in, and you feel solid about what you're going to be able to pull out.
Great. Okay, so Leah, if we can come back to this next slide and we talk about the performance management cycle again, we can revisit this. So Leah covered these sort of 4 steps in green that are in the lower right-hand part of the circle, from beginning the program and the data collection all the way to the completion of the data collection. So now we're done with the program, we're done delivering the program. Hopefully we've completed the program and completed all of our data collection accurately and as best as we can. Now I want to talk about the next 2 steps, which are the analyzing the data and preparing reports. So when we talk about analyzing data, there are a couple things I want everyone to keep in mind. I think the first is to give yourself as an organization or program as an individual some time to actually properly analyze the data. I know there's always a time crunch and a rush, and people want to know quickly what's going on with the program, but you need to give yourself and ask others to give you the appropriate time to be able to actually analyze the data and analyze it accurately. Now, in addition to that, you should also not just look at the overall sort of results of your program, but also think about how differences in demographic characteristics or differences in attendance may lead to different outcomes among your population of participants that you're serving. So are there differences between males and females? Are there differences between locations, differences between race and ethnicity, differences between those who came more frequently versus those who came less frequently? Those are the kind of differences that if you really analyze and kind of drill down in your data to that level of detail can really tell you some interesting and important things about how your programming is operating. Ideally, all of the outcomes are going to be the same across all of the subgroups that you look at, but in reality, there's often these subtle and sometimes not so subtle differences which can really give you a clue into changes that you can make to improve the outcomes of those participants that aren't succeeding as well as you would hope that they would succeed. Now, this third point I think is really important and something I think we struggle to do as nonprofits is to ask for help, ask for assistance, ask for guidance if you need it. If you don't know how to analyze, pre and post surveys, if you have difficulty understanding and how to aggregate and how to talk about case note information, it's okay to ask for help. And you can ask for help from people that you may know in the evaluation field. You can ask it from local partners in the university settings or college settings. You can ask your funders to really see if they can provide you some assistance on how to kind of you think of these processes and how you can do some analysis techniques to really get at the types of data and information you want to get at. And then finally with this, I really would encourage you to consider and to think about and then ultimately document any limitations of your data or any limitations of your analysis. And what I mean by that is it's okay to say that you had some incomplete data or you had a certain percentage of missing post-tests and pre-tests, or you were only able to get case notes for 1 or 2 caseworkers as opposed to all 4 or 5. It's okay. It really is all right. I can tell you as an evaluator it's okay. But what you want to do to make sure it's okay is to recognize those limitations and not lie about them or to not hide them. You have the data you have. You can draw conclusions from that data, but recognize that there are limitations that are going to exist and be upfront with them. And I think then people will really agree with you and help support you in the interpretations you're trying to make from that data. So we've asked, yep, go ahead.
All right, I have a couple things to add. So for that last bullet, Isaac, that's definitely part of the learning organization piece, right? Like, it's okay if you have limited data. It's okay if you have outcomes that you didn't meet. But at least you have that information. At least the organization has information that they can use to make changes if needed. For the second bullet and the first bullet, one thing I think is important to keep in mind is sometimes during this process we forget to go back to the program staff, and I think it's important, in my experience, a lot of times staff have new perspectives about what happened in the program, and so they might have ideas about how to analyze the data or certain things to look at that they may not have thought of in the initial discussions or midway through the program.
I think that's a great point, Leah.
And then the final just addition I would want to make was the attendance data. I think the most common sort of, not mistake, but challenge with interpreting attendance data is attendance first, like at the individual level versus aggregate, and attendance rates. And so I can't tell you how many times I've seen at the end of a program someone really needed an attendance rate, but they didn't set that denominator to be the same for all participants.
Yeah, I think part of this process, and I didn't touch it on at the beginning, but I'm glad you said that because it helped to remind me that part of the definition of success, when you talk about success at the beginning, we really focus it on success for participants, but in the reality of the situation, because most of our organizations have funders that we are somehow accountable to, they have reporting requirements, and those reporting requirements oftentimes we really do need to think about or include in our definitions of success, because they're going to really help us focus on the data that we ultimately need to have so that when we do need to do reporting, you will have that information and data available at this stage of the process and kind of the remaining stages that we're going to talk about. But I purposely didn't bring it up in the success discussion because I don't want everyone to really be focused on just what the funders are requiring or just what the funders are saying you have to collect. Part of being a data-driven organization with good performance management capacity is you should be thinking about what you as an organization need in terms of data first and what the funders require of you second. So I recognize that what the funders require is important in terms of the day-to-day operation and just the real world of operating a nonprofit organization. But at some point, I would hope that nonprofits would be able to move past that and really be focused on their own data needs and requirements before looking at just what the funder wants. So Ingvild, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, we have a question about what if you have a difficult system to record data set up by outside or remote administrative body? What do you do then? Do you weed out data, or do you look to have them analyze the data for you? And it seems like that's something that could very easily become a problem in performance management, just because you need access to the data frequently. And what do you guys think about that?
That is definitely something we at Omni experience a lot, because we're managing a lot of different organizations' data for them. And so it's, I think, a balance of, you know, providing them with what they need, but also helping them understand what they need. And so for me, I would say, you know, the biggest skill there is the relationship that you have with the person that's hosting your data and the agency, and really working together to identify common language so you're speaking the same language, and then, you know, come up with a work plan or some sort of an outline of what data do you need when, you know, really outline those expectations, and that would be sort of my thought on that.
Yeah, and if I can quickly add on here, I think it really is situational. I mean, there may be situations where you just say, we're going to focus on a couple things and try to get as good of data as we can on those couple things, and then try to weed through or kind of slog through the process as we go forward. But if you know, are you really in a stuck place where the data is not quality and you don't trust it, or the outside organization you're working with is really not getting you what you need or not very cooperative, then, you know, there's nothing wrong with re-examining those relationships and saying, maybe this is a point in the process of where we are as a program or organization to say it's time to start over. And start over may mean a new data system, it may mean a new partner, it may maybe bringing in someone in with a different level of expertise or training to kind of re-look at the situation and give you new opinions on it. I think that it really is dependent on exactly where you are, but I don't think organizations should be afraid that they have to be locked into their existing systems if it really is at a troublesome point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's part of that larger commitment, right? Like, if you're really committed to becoming data-driven and having an effective performance management system in place, then you have to take those steps that are going to help you get there, which is, you know, having a data management system in place that works for you.
Yeah, well said, well said. So let's go to the next few slides here, because I do want to make sure that we get done by 4 and still give time for some questions as well. So this next step after you've analyzed the data is really focusing on preparing reports. And really, it's not just about preparing reports, but it's preparing reports in a usable format. So you should be focusing on the major messages, the major takeaways, the major talking points that you want people to take away from this information and data when you present it in a report format. Now, in addition to that, you should consider different types of reports and different formats for different audiences. Your internal staff, your frontline staff, your direct service staff are probably going to want to see different types of reports focused on different types of concepts than an executive director or a member of your board of directors, or an outside person who is a media person versus someone who is a potential funder. All of those types of audiences might want to be focused on different things, and therefore you might need reports presented and focused on different things to satisfy all those audiences. In addition, you should also think about different report types here as well. So some people are more open to graphs or charts. Some people like text. Some people like verbal reports. So there could be audio components or presentational components as well. Some people like a 2-page written document. Other people want a 20-page written document with 20 pages of appendices and tables. I think thinking about all of these different audiences and who likes what, and really trying to kind of focus your reporting on those is really, really important as you start thinking about what your report should look like. But given that, I think it's also important to balance the comprehensiveness of your reports along with the speed and the types of findings that you want shared among these audiences. So you don't want to take years to prepare your reports, but you don't want to do reports that are so quick and fast that they're only communicating one thing and it doesn't let you to get to the amount of rich outcome data or information that you want to present for your program or for your situation. I think the biggest guidance I can give to people in terms of reporting or thinking about reports is reports should provide two things. They should provide, first, some information to help answer some very basic questions or even some more moderate or advanced questions. So you look at a report and you have questions, and some of those questions are going to be answered by looking at the report. But the best reports will do a second thing, which is they will motivate the report viewer, the audience, to start thinking about additional questions. It'll pique their interest where they can then re-engage with you as a programmer, as an organization, to say, I saw this on this report, or I've noticed that this trend is happening. Have you looked at this? Or I'd like to know this additional information. So a report is a tool to provide information, but also make sure that you're getting engagement from the audience to continue a dialogue, to continue a discussion so you can share more and more about your work. So if we can go back to the performance management cycle now, so I've talked about these two steps on the bottom left-hand corner in sort of a turquoise color, the analyzing data and the preparing reports. And so now we've gotten to the point where we've done our setup for the program, we've done the things beforehand, we've then done the program and done the data collection, and we've analyzed the data and we've got our reports prepared. But there's still two steps left. And I want Leah to talk about these two steps because I think these two steps are the two that are most often overlooked by nonprofit organizations. But these are probably the single two most important steps to making sure you get performance management right. So Leah, can you take these two steps?
Yes, definitely. So I'm going to ask everyone to just take another 20 seconds to look at the bullet points here. Do these bullet points look familiar? Good. Remember the last slide? Good. We already did this process. A lot of what Isaac just talked about is sort of re-summarized here. And this is where the recursive nature of performance management comes into play. So once again, we're going to be examining data, attempting to explain what the data means through collaborative discussions in various settings with key people. And key people can be different in different situations. Performance management that is done well always includes ongoing discussions around data at several different stages of the program. I just wanted to reiterate this again. So these will include anyone helping with the evaluation process, perhaps frontline staff, program managers, and maybe other leaders in the organization, maybe even board members, or other funders. And those two sort of mini bullets under the second bullet kind of go back to what I was saying before is, do staff have some new theory as to why things happened or didn't happen? And what Isaac was saying before about, using the reports to identify areas that seem, I don't know, interesting or troubling or could be wrong, right? Because we as evaluators make mistakes. And then finally, written information can come in different formats for different audiences. So like Isaac was saying, some people like a bulleted list of information, like a fact sheet. For funders, all the way to, 30-page, really intense analysis on a program which you've been collecting data on for 5 years. And so this is the time to pull all of that together, share it with the staff, and then start making decisions, start using the information in these reports to inform your discussions. So it's kind of like you talk and you talk, but what are you ultimately going to do with this information?
And I think the point I'd like to make there, Leah, really quickly is you want to share your reports. The reports you generate should be shared with a variety of different people. It surprises me how often I work with nonprofit organizations and people prepare or generate reports, but so many people have not seen them or even talked about this stuff. And I think it's unfortunate when people prepare and put in all of this work and generate reports, but then don't share them with other people within or among the organization or even outside the organization.
That's a great point. And I think also, you know, creating reports that are useful to staff at various levels, right? So you have a report that is useful to a case manager that might not be useful to the program manager of that program, but that doesn't matter. It's helping that case manager do their work better. All right, so where are we? All right, so now we're talking about, we've talked and we've shared, so what are we going to do with this information? What worked, what went wrong, and what didn't have any effect? These are the questions that the data generated and should have been part of all of those discussions we just talked about. So work with your staff to identify any programmatic changes that can be made to improve outcomes. They might have ideas for this, you might have ideas for this. It might be that parties need to go back and do more research about a certain piece of the program to help inform what those changes might make. Changes can be small or they can be big. It really depends on the outcomes that are observed. And then ask questions about the data collection methods. Is there a reason that outcomes, could there be a reason for outcomes as much as the programmatic approach? So is it something outside of the programmatic approach that affected the outcomes? You know, what are all of the variables that come into play when you're thinking about whether or not you reached your outcomes, how well you reached them, if you need to make changes? There's a lot of things to consider. Isaac, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important point here is, again, you don't collect data just to collect data or to satisfy funders or to keep the checks coming through the door. I mean, in reality, yes, you do, but more importantly than that, you collect data and information and measure your outcomes to figure out what you're doing well, but more importantly, figure out what you're not doing so well so that you can better serve your clients, better serve your participants the next day, the next week, the next year, the next time they come through your doors. So it's not good enough to collect all this data. It's not good enough to identify all of your data collection methods and define success. It's not enough to generate really pretty and interesting reports if you don't actually do something with that information. And by do something, I mean you look at it, you collect it, you analyze it, you think about it, and then you use the information to make programmatic changes because the program can always be improved. Your services can always be improved, and the way you figure out how you can improve things is by identifying where your outcomes are good and where your outcomes are not so good, and doing things and taking steps to make sure that you can improve those outcomes the next time you deliver the program or the service. So Leah, if I can quickly go to the next slide, I think really to sort of wrap up this part of the webinar, I really want to kind of emphasize the point that if you're doing performance management well and kind of sticking to the cycle of performance management, we've gotten through all of those steps and you're at the point where you start the process again. And what I mean by that is if you've truly generated outcome data and information that you can then utilize to make programmatic changes, well, when you change the program, your definition of success might change. And it might be a subtle change or it might be a large change. You may do really large programmatic changes or change a curriculum, or you might make subtle changes, but you have to think and ask, does my definition of success change at all for my participants or for my program? And if it has, well, then you've got to start the process again and think about, well, how do I collect data in different ways? What are my methods? What am I offering different training to staff? So that's where it really becomes a process, and it's a process that never really ends if you're doing it correctly, because you're going to continue to evolve and continue to change what you do as a program and what services you deliver. But in addition, you're going to change your definition of success, which is going to mean you're changing your definition, how you collect data and information, which means you're going to have to change your trainings and your reportings and how you're going to look at outcome data and how you're going to share the information, and it's going to continue to go on and on as your program and as you evolve, as your program changes and evolves. So if we can get to the next slide, Leah, I really just wanted to emphasize the whole cyclical nature of this and really why it's a cycle and not a linear process, because you are starting with the defining of success, ending, well, not really ending, but coming to the point where you're using your outcome data to make programmatic changes, and that probably is going to change your definition of success, and the whole process is going to start over again. Now, we're at 4 o'clock. We're at 4 o'clock, so I want to respect everyone's time. I want to go over 2 quick pieces of information really quickly before we get to the questions. Leah, if you can advance really quickly to some of the slides about with our contact information. So it would be probably 3 slides forward, slide 28. Oh, let's come back one. So here's our contact information if you want to follow up with us at all. I also want to highlight both of us, both Leah and myself have Twitter accounts. If you want to follow us on Twitter, we often tweet about this information. And again, all of this information, including the slides and the recording of the webinar, is going to be available on the Performo website, and it's all going to be emailed to you in about a week's time as well. So Leah, if we can get to the next slide, I want to quickly highlight the next 2 webinars that are going to be being done by PerformWell. The first is going to occur on March 7th. And this webinar, Lives on the Line, Why and How Mission-Driven Leaders Are Embracing Performance Management, is going to be offered by David Hunter, who's one of the foremost thinkers on performance management and evaluation among nonprofit organizations. And he's really going to focus on how leaders within a nonprofit organization and even people who aren't leaders in the organization can really embrace the culture of performance management and what it takes to actually do it. So again, on March 7th, 2013, and you can find out more information on the PerformWell website. There's also one other webinar I want to highlight, which is happening on April 11th, that I will be doing with Bridget Laird, who's the CEO of Wings for Kids. And in that one, we're going to talk about how you can use your performance management data to help with fundraising. So I know that this is a big topic that many people are interested in. Bridget and I will actually talk about our experience of how when you do performance management right, you get a lot of good data, and you can use that data to generate more funds for your organization or for your program. So we've hit the point now where we want to go ahead and go back to Ingvild and bring her back in and to start doing some questions from the audience. You know, really take some time. Leah and I are going to be on the webinar for about another half an hour and try to get to as many questions as possible. For those of you that need to ring off, that's okay, we understand. And for those of you who have questions, now is the time. Ingvild, can we bring you back in?
Yeah, we have lots of good questions, actually. So first of all, thank you very much for that presentation. And you know, one of the things that you were talking about in the beginning was certain things that need to be done before the program in that cycle. And one person is saying that it would be lovely to do this from the beginning, but my programs have been operating for several years, and data collection and outcome measures have evolved over the years based on funding and staff changes. How do you jump into the middle of the cycle? And of course, this is going to be the case for most people probably on this call, that their programs are currently taking place.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the reality of the situation, it's rare that you're going to get a clean break point where you can truly start the cycle cleanly and from a true start point. But like this question that was asked, most of the time you have to jump right into systems and processes that are already in place, and that's okay. I think what you have to do is you have to start somewhere, and you have to jump in somewhere. And what you have to do is be respectful of what's happened in the past and what's being collected now and what sort of your funder requirements are, but then also start to think a little bit outside the box and think about how you can start moving your data collection and your outcomes measurement and your methodology and tools to a different direction. I think when I'd be curious to have Leah talk about this as well, but I think when we worked at LAYC, and certainly when I started, I jumped into an organization that was 30 years old and had, you know, a way of doing things over 30 years, and you had multi-generational staff with a culture of what the organization looked like and a culture of data collection. They just have their own way of doing things, and you at some point need to come in and be respectful and say, I know the way things have been done in the past, but I want us to think about how we can shift things and move things going forward. And it's important to keep in mind that this is, we made the point earlier about how you need to start small, and I think this is a perfect reason why you need to start small. You're not going to flip the culture or change everything really quickly within a matter of weeks. It's going to take years, multiple years, especially if it's a larger organization, to really kind of shift the thinking and get things moving in a direction where you're building up your capacity for performance management. I think also an important thing to keep in mind too is as you become more and more sophisticated with your performance management, you're going to start changing the way you think about applying for and then ultimately writing grants and proposals, and also articulating what you're going to be responsible for reporting, in future years. And again, that process is going to take some time as well. You have to see through grants that you already have with certain reporting requirements or restrictions. You need to be respectful of that and still collect information, but you need to be thinking in the future too and looking forward and saying, if and when this grant ends, or how can we renegotiate the types of things we're going to report here within a framework of what we want as an organization in terms of what data we would like to have, so that we can determine if our program or if our organization is successful.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that just by saying that, implementing any kind of new system requires a lot of learning. And so it's completely understandable that steps may happen out of order, and that's okay. It's just part of the learning process.
Okay, great. Thank you, both of you. And several people have asked us about the difference between evaluation and performance management. And I sent out on the chat a couple of times a link to a very good research brief by Childtrends that's called Performance Management and Evaluation, What's the Difference? So you can access that. It's just 8 pages. But Leah and Isaac, do you want to speak to that a little bit? I think guess one of the, a couple of questions that sort of relate to it have to do with this whole idea of performance management being sort of change, continuous change and continuous improvement, right? And so, one person is asking us, and I think this relates very much to that difference between evaluation and performance management. If you make adjustments to the program midway through, doesn't that affect the consistency of your data collection measurements? If you want to speak to that a little bit as well as the differences, that would be great.
Sure. Okay. So there's 2 parts to this question. So I want to address the difference between performance management and evaluation first. So evaluation, in kind of the truest sort of technical sense of the term, is really focused on whether or not the program, however it is defined, or the intervention of the service worked or not. And so there's a determination of, at the end of the program, after everything is done, did it work or not, and what data do we have to indicate whether or not it worked or did not work. And then also the good evaluations will provide some explanation as to why it worked or it didn't. So an evaluation really is focused on that central question. Did it work? And more importantly, it's also looking at just data at a beginning point and an end point usually, because sometimes evaluations can take years, 2, 3, 4 years, depending on what you're looking at, to really get enough information to say it worked or not. But in reality, an evaluation is more of a retrospective look. It looks at something that has happened in the past and whether or not that thing worked, however you define it worked to be. Now, performance management is more of a real-time sort of initiative or way of looking at things. It's really saying we're at a point right now where we're doing something, we're delivering services, and we want to collect enough information to be able to say, is it working at this point in time, and are there things that we can actually change to make it work better tomorrow or within the very near future? So there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of things that are done commonly between evaluation and performance measurement and performance management, but I think the key distinction is evaluation is looking at success at one point in time, where performance management is looking at success as a continuous evolutionary thing in real time, to really, with the intent of making changes to continually improve the program. Now, the question that you brought up, the second part of the question, is a really interesting one that evaluators and performance management professionals are really struggling with at this time, because in theory, if you make too many changes to a program or a service that's undergoing a formal evaluation, then you may be skewing or the evaluation results in some way. And so that's why it's important to kind of think about what performance management is going to look like and how it actually is going to operate in the grander scheme of whether or not an evaluation is going to be done. So the way I often sort of encourage people to think about this, particularly in the nonprofit setting, is you want to be doing performance management for the majority of the life of your program to the point where you think you've gotten the program so well functioning and getting such consistent outcomes that then you're ready to do an evaluation, because there will be so little change that occurs within your program that it won't affect the way an evaluation is going to be run or what the results are going to look like. But for the majority of nonprofits, they will never really get to the point where they're actually ready to do a formal evaluation, nor, quite frankly, are they going to be able to get to the point where they can afford a formal evaluation. And that's why we encourage people, organizations and nonprofits, to start thinking about performance management first and use performance management practices to get you to a point, ideally, where then you are so locked into the way you're doing things and you've evolved to the point where you're so good that you're ready for a formal evaluation. Does that make sense?
I think so. And one person is asking us in this connection, do you see performance management and performance measurement as synonymous terms?
Do you want to take that one, Leah, or do you want to do it?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think they're two different terms. So I think performance measurement is really the collection of data and kind of everything associated with the collection of data. So I am measuring my weight if I'm on a diet. I'm measuring my heart rate. I'm measuring my cholesterol levels. I'm measuring my academic success using report card grades, my math and reading grades. Performance management is not only measurement, but it's also what you do with the data as well. So if I see that I'm not losing weight as part of my diet, then I've measured my weight and I'm not making changes, and I see no change, then the management practice is I look at that and say, well, what am I going to change in what I'm doing to make sure that the outcomes and the information, the data move in the direction I want it to be. So performance measurement is a component of performance management, and the key distinction is measurement is just measurement. Management is doing something with the data, making programmatic or service changes to make sure that you're trying to get the outcomes to go in the direction you want them to go.
And at the organizational level. I mean, you're using the information to manage decisions
resources
all the way to the top.
Yeah, well put. I think that, that's another good distinction. It literally is management, and it's figuring out how you can better or more efficiently allocate and utilize your resources to accomplish and achieve the success that you've defined already.
Okay, and then I think the two of you are up for a challenge, right? We have a couple of people who are asking us about how to create indicators that give the data we need to show program success. And I'd like to ask those of you who have asked those questions to type into the chat what the specific outcomes are that you're looking for, and perhaps we can use those as a little bit of a case study or example and talk through that a little bit. So before we get to that, let's see if we can take some other questions here. We have one that's asking, in the age of open data and big data, should the data from organizations be shared openly with other organizations and the public? What's your take on that?
So I saw that question and I really liked it, because I think this is one of these kind of issues in the year 2013 that I think people are going to start thinking more and more about. And I think for so many things, the answer to this is really it sort of depends, and it depends on your comfort level in working and sharing that information with other organizations or people, and your comfort level, and actually what you're going to share. I mean, I think I've seen examples where you're sharing, very, very low-risk information for certain populations or common populations with other groups. So you might have 3 or 4 nonprofits that are serving the same neighborhood or same community, and they might share some very high-level data amongst each other. That's one kind of lower-risk way of doing things that will provide some information. But I've also seen instances and discussions where people are actually talking about sharing essentially everything with a common group of participants and saying, if organization 1 served this participant for 5 days and organization 2 had the participant come in for 20 days, what are the what are the outcomes that are achieved for that particular participant, and how does that compare with another participant who's getting services from organization 3 but not organization 1. I think that level of detail is really something you as an individual organization or with your partner organizations really need to think about. And I think as part of this, you also need to understand and really generate formal agreements as to what's shared and what shouldn't be shared with other partners or the general public as well. So if you enter into some sort of agreement with another organization about what you're going to share, there should be a memoranda of understanding or agreement that says, we're going to share it with you, but we don't want you to share it with anyone else. We don't want you to talk publicly about this information, or if you do, we want to stipulate that this is the way it has to be shared publicly. So I'm all about data sharing. I'm all about kind of aggregating the data to get as big data as possible, but there's just a lot of very human and legal and just common sense things that need to be worked through first, depending on the situation.
Okay, and one of the people who asked the question about indicators has responded back, so let's take that question. The question is, do you have resources around how to identify meaningful leading indicators of success if your ultimate success is measured only once a year? And the specific measure that this person is talking about is student achievement on standardized tests. And Isaac, as you talk about this, I'd love to put this a little bit in the context of PerformWell, because this is one of the primary things that we're trying to help you all with PerformWell. So do you want to take that, Isaac?
Sure. I mean, I think part of this, and if this were to be a consulting session with this organization, I think part of where I'd want the discussion to start out with is, okay, well, we're talking about achievement on standardized test scores. Well, you got to let me know if that's math or reading or something else. And let's assume and let's focus on it's sort of math and reading. And then I wanted to sort of think about, okay, well, what exactly are we trying to determine, or what are we trying to measure? Are we looking at it at the classroom level or at the individual level? Do you want to know if a third grade class has achieved such and such level on standardized tests, and then the next year we're looking at that, the same teacher or the same classroom, or are we really looking at third graders who then graduate to fourth graders and looking how they change and evolve over time? Now, depending on how you answer that question, then you start getting to think about, well, there could be some interim indicators that may talk about the success and the growth and change in a more short-term environment. And so, examples that come to mind is there are things like, you could use things like report cards if you're looking at individual level change. And while it's different than standardized tests, and often report cards have their own sort of biases, that's part of accepting kind of the limitations of your data and the limitations of your data collection methods. But at least if you look at a report card from one grade period to the next, then you can at least start to get a determination of how someone is progressing from their math score from one reporting period to the next, to the next, to the next. In addition, I've seen many school districts that offer sort of interim standardized tests or mini standardized tests as well at either the district level or at the school level. So if you have some sort of test that can be offered that is aligned with or similar to the standardized test, but is much shorter and much lower risk, but still given on a regular basis, you can look at the change and growth in reading or math functionality there as well. I'd also start asking questions about, okay, are there any other associated characteristics that you might be looking at in addition to math reading performance? Are we talking about educational aspirations or aspirations to completing high school or college, or any other sort of general youth development things that you would be interested in? That's where I would point people to PerformWell and say, once you've articulated sort of these other things that you'd be focused on, there are components, there is guidance in PerformWell on some of these concepts. And I don't know if, Ingvild, if you want to talk specifically about it, if you had a specific example in mind.
I didn't have anything specific in mind, but I think that this is exactly what we are trying to do with PerformWell. So yeah, definitely explore it a little bit. And much of what you were talking about, Isaac, is also what I was thinking about. What are sort of interim steps or interim outcomes that you can look at that relate to the 1 year, once a year kind of test.
And if I can do one more thing just to follow up on this, I think part of the distinction between performance management and evaluation is there's sort of a fuzziness to performance management. I mean, some evaluation is fuzzy as well, but there tends to be a little bit more fuzziness, and I'll throw that out there as a technical term, with performance management. And again, it's as long as you recognize sort of the limitations of your indicators and your measures, that's okay. You want to have something that at least kind of gives you some thought or some guidance as to whether or not you are making a difference or moving the needle in the right direction. So in this example, yes, report cards might not be the absolute best indicator you can utilize, but report cards are probably something that are pretty easily accessible. They're already tracked, so you're not doing any new data collection, but at least they give you some guidance as to how students may or may not be improving on their math or reading or some of these other concepts that might be important to you. That there might not be another easy way to kind of get at that information in an interim basis.
Okay, and the other person who asked us about indicators has responded and says, first, can you speak to what is the relationship between indicators and data? So I guess we're looking for a little bit of definition here. And then secondly, what kind of indicator would show success in a program of community engagement? And this person has looked at some examples and says that gathering data is usually around meeting attendance and participation. Maybe that's all we can look at. Do you two have other suggestions?
Okay, so let's talk indicators and data first. So indicators really are things to help you understand or interpret or just get a hold of whether or not you are moving in the right direction towards an outcome or ultimately what you want to achieve. So if we use the example that we just talked about, if your ultimate definition of success is improvement on standardized test scores, then improvement on report card grades, and let's use math and English again as an example, if a child improves their math or reading grades, then that's an indicator that you are on the right path, you're going in the right direction to having changes or improvement in standardized test scores. So indicators really are indicating whether or not you're moving in the right direction or not. Data is data. It's information. It's the report card grades themselves, or it's attendance, school attendance, that you interpret to help you understand whether or not the indicators are being met or whether or not you're moving in the right direction. So I think there's a subtle distinction. The data is the data. It's the information you collect. Indicators are things you specify that say, if this gets achieved, then we know that we are on to the right track. Now, community civic engagement, is that the example that was asked about, Ingvild?
No, it says community engagement.
Okay, so community engagement, I think, and again, this is one of these really big, broad, encompassing terms that you know, if I had the person online and we had more time, I'd ask them to tell me what they mean by community engagement. But what I've seen as community engagement in the past is really whether or not the community, however the community is defined, is becoming more invested in a series of processes. It could also be how members of the community are being invested in processes as well. And I think the person is right to indicate that you know, attendance at meetings or attendance at sessions or trainings is really kind of the first indicator of community engagement. You know, you've got to get people to show up first, and if people aren't showing up, then that's probably an indicator that things are going not, you know, not in the direction you'd want them to be going. But having them simply show up isn't necessarily an indicator that they are being engaged. And so then it starts talking, then you want to start looking things about like such as repeat attendance or repeat engagement. So they come once, but do they come again? And do they come on a regular basis? Because if people come 3 or 4 or 5 times to a series of meetings or a series of events or activities, then you can start thinking about them as becoming more engaged in the process. Then you also want to talk about, well, if you have frequent attenders or people that are coming on a regular basis, are any of them doing anything as part of their work? So are they coming and sitting in the back of the room and not engaged and not doing anything, or are they participating in the meetings? And not only are they participating, but also are they then taking leadership or really helping out with sort of the larger projects that you're trying to address? So I think attendance is a good starting point. Then you start looking at repeat attendance and repeat just people who are coming on a more frequent or regular basis, however you define that. And then it's once they come on a regular basis, then what are they doing to get them closer to or as potential indicators to them becoming more engaged, however you end up defining engagement.
And I think one of the challenges for when you're talking about engagement in a community is for when people leave or they don't engage for a while, is it necessarily a bad thing? Is that something negative? For example, we're working with a client right now where their overall goal is to create a broader SOBR network by providing they have different chapters that provide outdoor activities and various activities for people in recovery to come and join. And so, we're looking at attendance and participation, of course, but it's been really challenging thinking about if people leave and say they left because they went and had a baby or they moved, it doesn't necessarily mean they relapsed. It just means that they haven't been coming. And so how do you deal with those pieces? And I think that's just part of the challenge of doing this kind of work is, all of the moving pieces and all of the considerations that you have to think through when you're working through indicators and outcomes.
Yeah, well said, Leah.
Okay, and a lot of people are asking us about data analysis. One question here is, the person is commenting that your discussion about data analysis seems to emphasize pre-post analysis. What about setting goals in terms of a status measure? For example, the number of students who complete a program, the number of students who stay out of trouble, etc.
I think those are fine, except that I think that there's a limited amount of information that you would get from if you look just at those measures. I think if you're looking at those measures in addition to other things, I think that's great, because I think let's take program completion as an example. I would, depending on the program and depending on the population, just because someone comes frequently enough and to complete the program, however that's defined, it may or may not be an indicator or might not be evidence of an actual change in behavior. Now, if you're talking about a really high-risk population or a population that usually doesn't stick to what you'd expect them to stick to, then absolutely program completion is an outcome. But I think it really just depends on the population and sort of what you're looking at. Now, the reason I really emphasize sort of pre and post measures is because I think that is the easiest way to look at sort of behavior change for participants. You look at where someone is at the beginning of the program and kind of what their attitudes and opinions and behaviors are like, and you deliver the program, and then you look at where they are at the end, and you compare the beginning data to the end data and see if there's any change. If you're just looking at end data or you're just looking at kind of a status that's achieved, it can be an outcome. It could be something that's informative, but it could not be. It could just be saying that this person, attended enough meetings that we considered them to have completed, but really in the grand scheme of things, did they make any sort of larger changes that we want to consider as an outcome? So this is where, again, the definition of success becomes really, really important.
And I guess also the distinction between looking at progress and sort of how a person is doing at the individual level versus program level success. Because of course, when you look at things like program completion and such, it could be an indicator of how the program is doing, at least when it comes to service delivery at the aggregate level.
And you also need to think about sort of what a person would do just generally without your intervention as well. So, I mean, I think take high school graduation as an example, right? I mean, I think so many programs focus on high school graduation and see that as a good, important outcome, and it is in and of itself. But programs and nonprofits don't also take the additional step, which is, well, I bet some portion of our population would have graduated high school without our help. And really what your outcome is the difference between those that would have graduated graduated without your help compared to those that you actually did make a difference in graduating. And that's why I think looking at sort of pre and post is really important. Or if you're going to look at kind of achieving a condition or achieving an endpoint, asking the question of how many of these participants, of these students, would have gotten this far absent our giving our services or intervention.
Okay, and it's almost 4:30, so let's take one last question. We have a person here who probably will want to attend the webinar on fundraising. This person is asking, what do you recommend when the funder expects outcomes that are unreasonable? Would you do what I would call defensive evaluation, meaning also measure outcomes you think are more appropriate? What do you two think about that?
Depends on your capacity, I think. I mean, ultimately, like Isaac's talked about, you want to get to a place where you don't have to take money from funders that are asking for outcomes that don't align with your overall organizational goals and outcomes. Unfortunately, right now, that's not, in this current landscape, that's not always possible. And so, yeah, I think just, you know, make sure you're meeting the outcomes that the funder's asking for, but also integrate the outcomes that you're interested in your particular agency, or start having conversation with your funders about how to maybe tweak those outcomes so that it can meet both parties' needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, Leah. I mean, I think when it comes right down to it, you have to collect what you have to collect and report on to the funders to make sure that you want the checks to keep coming in the door. I mean, so the first question is, really is this funder so locked into this that you think it's actually causing harm to your organization and not allowing you to do what you really want to do? In most cases, that's not true, and you still want to collect the information. But I think as Leah hinted at, if you have the capacity, what you want to do is you want to collect additional information that you think is far more valuable, far more useful to you as an organization. And ultimately, then, you want to share that back with the funder and say, and I've had experience doing this, where I would come to the funder and say, here's what you wanted, here are what your reporting requirements are, but check out this additional information. This is what we use internally for our own purposes to measure the effectiveness of our programming. We'd love to give you this information as well. Do you want to take a look at it, or can we negotiate where I present you this type of information instead of what you're requiring, because what you're requiring is really putting an additional burden and not really helpful to us. And so I think it's difficult to have those conversations initially with the funder. I think you need to establish the rapport, you need to be comfortable, but also you need the data to back yourself up. You can't just start that conversation from the beginning without any data. You need to have the capacity and the processes in place where you are going to engage that conversation and you already have some level of data behind you that says, here's what you wanted, but here's what we've already collected. Now let's talk about this and really sort of evolve our reporting or evolve kind of what you're requiring from us. And I think that's, in my experience, been the most effective method to kind of get the funders to change their minds. And I call it funder education. I really do, because I think that the funders oftentimes don't think about how they are going to use the data themselves, or really what the data says about the success of a program or success of a particular intervention. And if you can provide them guidance on that, I think they become very appreciative of it.
Yeah, and do your research on them too, because there is starting to be a movement for funders to become more educated on sort of the expectations they're placing on their grantees, and whether or not the outcomes that they're identifying are realistic and appropriate. And so it could be that your funder's open and willing to have that conversation from the start.
And we are going to be talking about some of these things in both of the next two webinars, I think. So I'd encourage everyone to sign up for those. So we are a few minutes past the 90 minutes we had allocated. So thank you so much to both of you, Isaac and Leah, for being with us today. And thank you very much to all of our audience for sticking around for so long.
Great. Thank you again, Leah. I really appreciate it. You agreeing to do this webinar with